Everybody, happy to talk with you about Nonprofit Leadership 101 and starting and leading an effective nonprofit organization. I was very pleased that Autumn would think of me to invite me here today. My name is Zach Kester. I am CEO and managing attorney of a nonprofit called Charitable Allies, and the nonprofit is also a law firm that represents nonprofit organizations. So we've got approximately 1,800 clients in about 45 states that do ministry work or other nonprofit NGO work in 50, 60 countries. So that's the kind of work we do. We deal with all aspects of operating and running a nonprofit and all its twists and turns. There's very little I've not seen at this point. My experience comes from being a nonprofit leader, because Charitable Allies is a nonprofit. It's a charity. It's been around about 10 years. But then also all of our clients are nonprofits or dealing with nonprofit issues, maybe founding one, or there's some question about a donation or something. So I'm also a believer. My wife and I, it's a core aspect of who we are. We've got 4 children. Our 2 oldest we adopted from Ethiopia when they were 11 and 7. The oldest is now just about 25. And she's got a 7-week-old daughter, so I'm a grandfather. They call me Grumps. Yeah. When she's about 4 and she's like, wait a second, grumpy means something and you're not really that, I will, yes.
I think you should leave it.
That's right, right. I am actually quite grumpy sometimes, so, but I will try to shield her from that, so. The beauty is I get to hold her and feed her and play with her for 2 hours and give her back. I love that. So, so our youngest is 17, almost 19, 21, and almost 25. Those are the age of my kids, and so it's just a little bit about me, a little bit about who we are. We're really active in our church. We attend Connection Point in Brownsburg. So, okay, so where do you start when you're thinking about a nonprofit? Really, you want to start with what's your goal? What are you hoping to do? What's your mission or your purpose, your core program? Who will you serve? That's really where you want to start. Because if you don't have a passion to do a specific thing or set of things, then you probably won't be an effective nonprofit leader. In fact, the vast majority of nonprofit leaders, this is where they start anyway, because they came into it and they had the desire to be a nonprofit leader because perhaps they received the services of a social services agency and they're like, that really helped my family when we were in a time of need. I want to your point, lean in and do that. Or they had a life-changing event on the mission field. Maybe they did some work in Ethiopia and they said, wow, there's a lot of poverty here. How can I help with this? That kind of thing. So most nonprofits leaders and founders especially really get into it because of the mission, and they have a pretty clear idea on what that is. But that is the logical and best starting place. Then one pivots to the programs. How are you going to serve those people? What's most effective? And what's interesting is so many of us believe that we know, we have an idea of what's best for the folks or that we're serving, rather than listening to them and what they say their needs are. And there's a fascinating data point on this that I've dealt with before. And a nonprofit that serves women in particular was really trying to measure employment and whether the women had become ready for employment and were employed. And it was really disappointed that a significant percentage of the women that they served were employed about 50, 60% of the time. And then they dug in and they realized it's because that's what they wanted, because they have children, and so they earn some money, but they also spend time being mom while their children's father or husband or whatever perhaps works full time. And so they needed to be able to work, identify and develop skills to be able to make a little bit more money, but they only needed so much for their household and then wanted to spend time with their kids. So it was fascinating to see the leaders of the nonprofit have very distinct ideas on what success meant for the people they were serving, and in reality, that's not what the people they were serving wanted anyway, right? So one thing I would say is, try to match what you want to do to what is needed within that community. And then you can build your programs from there. So then how would you do those things? Serve that population or that community in that way. Another thing to consider also is, are there other organizations or existing organizations that serve that mission in that area, that geographic area, or with that population? There are a couple reasons for this. One is just pure competition, scarce resources, doing duplicate services. But another, more importantly, is there might be opportunity for you to just join with someone else who's doing something similar. Many nonprofits offer a form of fiscal sponsorship, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. There are 6 models of fiscal sponsorship, and Model A really is, I've got an idea and I'll work for a nonprofit that already exists and deliver that program that I've thought of. That's Model A. Model B is, I'm an independent contractor and I'm still running the program, but it's kind of my program, it's kind of the agency's program, that kind of thing. And then Model C is what's called a pre-approved grantor-grantee relationship, where I fundraise, and I fundraise kind of with the name and the IRS determination letter, if you will, of that charity, but the donations are restricted to Program X, and I run Program X. So the fiscal sponsor grants, perhaps even in real time, or as close to real time as we can get in the financial world, grants in real time to me as fiscal sponsee to operate Program X, my program to serve that community in that way. So there's some options there. A shameless plug, Fiscal Sponsorship Allies is one of the most effective fiscal sponsors in the nation. It does the pre-approved grantor-grantee relationship. It's based here in Indianapolis, actually. It's got hundreds of fiscal sponsees. So it's one very low-cost way and very low-risk way to sort of start a nonprofit idea is fiscal sponsorship. You just find the right fiscal sponsor for your work, and you take off. Then, where do you start? So you figured out where, like, kind of what you want to do, who you want to serve, what the landscape, the competitive landscape, or whatever looks like. You're kind of assessing whether you want to start a new nonprofit or whether you could do a trial run in the context of fiscal sponsorship. So what do you start with? You want to start recruiting your first board members. In every state except Arizona, you need 3 total board members to serve on your nonprofit board. 1 can be you. So if you need 3, then you need to go get 2 more. In Arizona, it's only 1. It's a bizarre creature of law. Many Western states really view themselves as fiercely independent given their history, and Arizona is the only state to do this, but they require paper filing of articles of incorporation and a registered office that cannot be a UPS store. So we typically don't wind up going in Arizona. Anyway, nevertheless, you'll need 3 total board members. So you want to identify who they are. At least 1 needs to be independent. What do I mean independent? It means that they can't be related to you as a business partner or like by blood or familial relationship. So parent, child, grandchild, grandparent, spouse, at least 1 sibling, that kind of thing. At least 1 needs to be independent. Can't be those things. But 2 people, like a couple or something, could serve on a board together. But 1 needs to be independent, the third. Should be a friend, someone who someone who supports your work that you want to do.
But it can't be somebody you already have business dealings with. It has to be somebody you're not.
A business partnership with. It's called a 35% joint ownership. Okay. It's the 35% joint ownership rule. So if there are 4 partners and everybody has a quarter, it could be one of them.
Okay.
But 3, even 3 could, but it's 35% is the rule. So another consideration is, do you think that it'll be funded through 1 or 2 primary sources of revenue for the medium to long term? Or do you think that it will be able to fundraise from multiple sources of revenue? And that really helps you determine whether you'll be a public charity or private foundation. These are terms of art. Private foundation and public charity they're a little bit of a misnomer, but one could just use the terms charity or foundation. A charity is one that has relatively widespread public support. What's public support? It's donations from community foundations, churches, individuals, that kind of thing, family trusts, whatever, that kind of stuff. So that's a public charity. Private foundation is typically going to have funding from just a very small number of corporations or individuals or businesses. So, you got to think about how it's going to be funded, right? This part of the analysis here on public charity versus private foundations is relating to funding, but so we can sometimes skip this one at first and go down here, which is what's the funding going to look like? Are you going to get donations, contributions, and grants from foundations, grants from corporations, or are you going to do the program service revenue route, which I'll talk about here in a second, or a little bit of both. Program service revenue is you sell something. You sell goods or services in exchange for money. Well, what's that? You run a little theater, you sell tickets to the performances. That's fee-for-service revenue. You sell tickets and you get money, people attend the show. You sell merch, like Next shirts, right? Or whatever you youngins do these days, right? Keychains or I don't know, whatever it is. My kids tell me I'm very old, even though, as far as being a grandfather, I'm not that old.
How does that stay a
So.
nonprofit then if you're selling something?
It is called program service revenue, and it is permitted. In fact, in the United States, almost 60% of all nonprofit revenue is sales.
Okay.
So think hospitals. What do they sell? Medical services. Universities.
The difference is you're not pocketing that money and using it for yourself. Most of the time it's going back into the organization.
That's right. And that rule is what's called the non-distribution constraint. The official rule is called the non-distribution constraint. And the United States Supreme Court adopted that rule in the 1920s. And the case was a macaroni factory case. New York University, NYU, was bequeathed a macaroni factory by a benefactor. And then it operated a macaroni factory. And it said, because we're using the net profits for charity to support the university and its students and its professors and things, that operation of the macaroni factory is charitable. And the IRS was like, no, I don't think so. And the Supreme Court agreed with the IRS and said, destination of income is not the test. Destination of income being we're using all the profits for charity. That's not the test of whether an entity is charitable. What is the test is the primary activity. And in this instance, operating a macaroni factory is not charitable, so it can't be. So the sales have to be related to the tax exemption or the charitable nature of the organization. Universities, they exist to, they supposedly exist to provide education, right? And so then I pay tuition and I get education that culminates in a piece of paper that says I'm credentialed or whatever, right? Hospitals, right? They exist to provide medical care. So there's a financial trade there. My insurance company pays the bill, I pay some of it, and I get medical treatment. Theaters, museums, that's all fee-for-service stuff. Even parks sometimes, depending, big enough park and all of that, right? So almost 60% of the total revenue in the nonprofit space is program service, it's sales. Mm-hmm.
So something is considered a nonprofit by what they do, not by like their actual financial stuff.
Now, whether or not they make money, but what they're doing.
Yes,
Okay.
they're considered nonprofit by what they're doing, and also what's called the non-distribution constraint. We can't distribute the profits to private owners or shareholders. The profits, the net revenue is what is called in the nonprofit space, but effectively the profits that just get reinvested back into the organization.
But what about salary?
Yeah, that's not that doesn't violate the non-distribution constraint. So we're talking profits going to insiders or owners, right? So like dividends distributions at the sort of on a regular basis, quarterly or annually or something.
People that don't work for it but have ownership stake in it.
Yeah, but also insiders, so like officers and things.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's measured by what it does. That's right. One of the big questions, I went back a slide here, one of the big questions on that front in terms of measuring what it does is organizations have to serve what's called a charitable class. And so the things that it does has to be in furtherance of a recognized tax-exempt purpose under Section 501c3, religious, educational, scientific, literary, testing for public safety, charitable, right? These are the like buzzwords, and so each of them have definitions and all of that. And generally speaking, a nonprofit must pursue or serve a member of a charitable class or a group, one aspect of that charitable class, in order to be charitable. Plus, they can't distribute profits to owners, things like that. What are the steps to actually start a nonprofit? It's 3 big steps. One is create it. That's articles of incorporation. That's a filing with the Secretary of State, typically in the relevant state. The second step is organize, and that's those 4 things. Bylaws, conflict of interest policy, and EIN, which is a tax ID number provided by the IRS. Technically called an employer identification number, but an entity doesn't actually need to employ anyone to have one. But and then organizational actions, and that last one is just a checklist of board resolutions that is passed at the first board meeting. And a couple slides here we'll talk about that first board meeting and how that works. Other things happen in here depending on the type of agency it is. If it serves children, then it might also need various types of children or other high-risk populations, maybe persons with disability, people who are sick or infirm, is the tax phrase, elderly. If you serve a special population like that, you typically want various policies that protect your employees or your volunteers in your organization, as well as the people you serve. So think like background check policies, think like various employment policies, right? So like some of those things can come in the 4th step. Some need to happen in the organized step because they're required for this apply step, right? So you would talk with your advisor on which of those things are required here and which can be done later from a cost management perspective. I will answer the question of when can you fundraise here in just a second, then you apply. You apply to the IRS for recognition of your tax-exempt status. As long as you apply within 27 months of when you're incorporated, the IRS determination of tax exemption will be retroactive to your date of incorporation. So that then means that any funds you raise during that time are tax deductible for your donors. And that's the process. Articles of incorporation, that's a filing with the Secretary of State, has to have there are 4 clauses it has to have under federal law, and there are about a half a dozen things it has to have under state law. It's articles of incorporation. Organize is the next step, and this is your first board meeting. And then apply, which is apply to the IRS for recognition of tax-exempt status. So that's the process to create a nonprofit. And during that, in the middle step there, you're going to have your first board meeting. And in the first board meeting, you're going to elect your directors and officers, president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, those kinds of things. We don't have to use those titles. We can say chief bottle washer if we want. It doesn't really matter. But under the law, certain functions have to be done. Things like minutes. Who's going to take notes of this meeting and make that a part of the corporate record? We typically call that a secretary, but we don't have to use that word, right? Then after that, you would do things like open a bank account. You take the bylaws, the EIN, some of the resolutions from your first board meeting, and go to the bank, open the bank account. So a couple of things we'll talk about is how to like run a meeting, not just the first meeting, but kind of some other meetings. What should be in the board agenda? What does the board need to consider? And what should be in the board packet? Well, typically, directors have several duties. They have the duty of care, which includes the duty of attentiveness, pay attention, and the duty of informed decision making. They have to kind of know material facts in order to make decisions. And that is all within the duty of care. Duty of care, duty of attentiveness, and duty of informed decision making. Hello. You also have the duty of obedience and the duty of I'm drawing a blank on the other one. There's one more. So typically, board members need to have reviewed the materials in advance of the meeting, which then means they need to be distributed prior to the meeting. So, typically 5 to 7 days is what I recommend, so that the board can review them and have conversation. There are some things that are run-of-the-mill types of things, like maybe a financial report if things are going fine for the organization. Generally, financial reports are there, but in terms of setting the agenda, I like to have a section called the consent agenda, which is we're not really going to talk about any of this stuff. Board members, you need to review all the materials, and we're just going to say accept it as information and move on, and we're not going to talk about it. Sometimes there might be an issue that needs to get flagged, and one of those items gets pulled out and moved later in the meeting, but the board then can still take action and focus on things that are high priority while remaining informed of the things they're supposed to stay informed. How many of you have been in a board meeting where it's like scheduled for 2 hours, we spend 90 minutes talking about, the profit and loss or the revenue, like the expenses, right? Total waste of time. Not always, but much of the time. If an organization is in like financial dire straits, that kind of attention is needed, right? That's the kind of thing a board should be doing if the wheels are about to fall off, right, financially. But it is a waste of time if, things are going fine.
We're doing fine.
Right. So what we typically want to do is rely upon board members' strengths and their ability to be creative. We find sometimes that board members, they check their business mind and their professional training at the door when they walk into the boardroom. It's kind of comical sometimes, and it's like that. We don't need a physician and an attorney and a pastor and an accountant to talk about how much the lampshade costs. That just is not effective use of time of all of those people. Like, it's just not, again, unless with the caveat of the financial health of the organization. So what do we want them to do? We want them to talk about the upcoming big program and how to help get the word out, or how to volunteer, or maybe the upcoming trip, and what does that trip look like and how can they get involved, or the big fundraiser that's coming up and how can they get involved. Like, we want their brains focused on the things where they can be most effective and most helpful to the organization. And how we do that is by the consent agenda. And it's like we spend less than 5 minutes on the consent agenda, we just approve it, and we move on down the agenda to old business and new business. Old business is stuff that carried over from prior meetings. New business is stuff we've not talked about before. New ideas, new programs, new fundraisers. So then what should be in there? The materials that support it. You want your P&L and your balance sheet and your whatever. You also want some reports, right? So in my board packet, they get a CEO report, they get a managing attorney report, they get a marketing report, they get all the financial reports. The consent agenda is typically 30 or 40 pages long, and we don't talk about it in the meeting because we're going to talk about all the rest of the stuff, which is usually fewer pages. Usually it's 10 or fewer pages, but it's the bigger generative stuff. How can we have the board members discuss things in such a way that they're generating ideas and pushing the organization forward, and we're using their unique skill sets in the meetings. Managing a good board meeting is actually very hard. It's an art in and of itself as well as a science. So. Okay, starting strong. What do the first 90 days look like of a nonprofit? So you're going to start the fundraising. Figure out who your prospects are. Figure out who might support your organization, who might come in early. Really figuring out your fundraising plan. Fundraising is also an art and a science. It's a fascinating art and science. On one hand, it's a numbers game. On the other hand, you have to have a really good case for support. You need to know what your sort of elevator pitch is. You need to know your inputs, your outputs, and your outcomes. What do I mean? Inputs, typically money and time. Outputs, the things we do, the widgets we make, the number of people we serve. What's the outcomes? Reduction of disease in that municipality or in that little village because they now have clean water, right? That's the outcome. I didn't do that directly. I didn't go kill the individual bacterium, I don't even know. Science isn't my thing, right?
Well, then you gave them training that then allowed them to kill the bacteria.
Right, or make sure their water was clean, and or dig the well, and or whatever, right? So, yep. Exemptions. So not only will you get your tax exempt status recognized by the IRS, but there are a whole bunch of other things that you could potentially do or take advantage of a nonprofit. You can get free or reduced cost software. A couple of vendors for that. One is called TechSoup. You can get a sales tax exemption depending on your state, meaning you don't have to pay sales tax when you go purchase things at stores or from Amazon or whatever. You can potentially, again, depending on the state, get a sales tax exemption when you sell things, so you don't have to collect and remit sales tax It's not an entitlement in every state, and the rules are all different, but that's another possibility. Some states you do have to apply to the state taxing authority to get the state income tax exemption. Typically, it's an entitlement once you get your federal tax exemption, but you do need to apply in the state in some instances. Other exemptions are nonprofit mailing rates from the U.S. Post Office. It's about 40% off, so you get your USPS nonprofit mailing rate. And there are a bunch of others. We have a guide that we provide to our clients that are startups that has something like 20 different possible things you can do. Once you've set up that are additional exemptions or discounts that you can access. So doesn't mean you have to do them all. Often 2 or 3 or 4 are particularly helpful. Board recruitment. Why am I talking about this again? Am I just repetitive? Well, yes. But you have your 3, now you need more. Right? A typical board, depending on the agency and size and its scope and scale, is going to be 5 to 9. Till you get to be a certain size, $1.5 million to $2.5 million in annual revenue, then you need to start to get to a bigger board, because your board will have a much bigger role to play in the fundraising space, because one person can only raise so much funds over and over and over. So board recruitment. And so some of it is like, okay, who? Sometimes you want to focus on skill sets. What are some of the skill sets you want to fill out? Other time it's just passion, what folks are passionate about the mission with you and want to support you in your work. Sometimes it is also about making sure that you're keeping folks connected to the mission that you need in order to accomplish things. So if you're doing things internationally, you might want someone on the ground in that country also on the board. That is permissible. You have to have one board member in the state in which it's incorporated, but other than that, you can have board members from anywhere across the country. If you serve youth, do you want a couple of youth members on the board? There's a little caveat to this, an asterisk. They don't count for the purposes of quorum and voting. You can let them vote, but their votes don't count. So that you can make them feel like they're important, but they're actually not in terms of their legal vote. But they are important because if we're serving youth, we want their input on what's effective for them. Right? So they have a seat at the table, they're participating, all of that.
Vote counts.
Right. Right. It counts, sort of. Yeah.
Why doesn't that legally count?
They're children, yeah. Children don't own property, they don't have rights. They don't own property. Yeah, my son's 17 and I could clean out his bank account and he'd have no recourse.
I
Yeah.
don't like that.
I'm not that stupid, but
Yeah.
I could. In fact, he's going to Iceland, and I'm buying the ticket, and so I could just take the money, but I need him to go through the practice of sending me the money. So, but that's just he's learned. I'm raising adults. I'm not raising children. Right. My goal is to help them learn how to be adults. So, all right. So we talked about some board recruitment. Volunteer recruitment, this isn't necessarily applicable to all organizations. Not all organizations use volunteers other than perhaps board members, but that's another sort of caveat. And part of the volunteer recruitment is also volunteer training, right? How does one keep volunteers engaged, and in what capacity? Is it seasonal? Is it around activities, a weekend or 1 month a year or whatever, or a couple times a year? So think about that. We do want to have various policies and procedures in place as we recruit volunteers that are like, okay, here's what volunteers do, here's how they operate, here's some protocols. Again, background checks is a thing if you're going to serve any sort of high-risk community, all of that. And then program development. So we started out by saying, what do you want to do? What's your mission? And how are you going to accomplish that by what programs? And then we need to continuously assess those programs. Were they effective? Did it do the things we wanted it to do? We had there's a great story I'm familiar with of Boys and Girls Club type of organization having a certain type of difficulty with academic attainment and maintaining a longer term relationship between mentors and the children and all of that. And so they started to, and it was in part driven by parents pulling their kids out of the program early because of chaos at the household, basically. And so they were like, okay, how can we decrease that challenge? The parents of these high risk children not getting their kids to the activities, essentially. And so the CEO challenged her staff to come up with ideas, and they implemented some of the ideas, and then they did a survey relating to that. And they realized they had a really good effect on certain type of volunteerism and donors, but they didn't actually wind up solving the problem that they were trying to solve. So then they went back to the drawing board and had some more ideas. And many staffers would have been angry at, well, but we had these positive effects. And you're right, we did have these positive effects, but it didn't accomplish the goal that we wanted it to accomplish. So we're going to keep aspects of that because it did have those positive effects, but it still didn't solve the thing that we were trying to solve for. And it really helped with managing people. Particularly, there's a stereotype of nonprofit leaders are all heart and no head type of thing, right? They may not have the best administrative or financial chops, but they have a really big heart, and maybe they're really good with relationship with people, that kind of thing. There's some stereotypes around that, and so that's also true of nonprofit staffers in the social services space from time to time. And so one of the best ways to manage those emotions, if you will, during the program development phase is to use data and to really set clear goals and identify whether you've driven towards those goals. But as I said, we want to work towards revisiting the programs and the program development and to see if that has improved or can be improved. And that's all in the first 90 days, and then budgeting, right? This is the point at where we want to budget. How many of you run a personal or household budget for yourselves? Yeah. My son does not, and he got himself in trouble, and that's what we spent last night talking about. He overdrew his bank account, and I'm like, well, what are you going to do to get over this, right? Hashtag college students. But
I think bank account shouldn't be able to be overdrafted.
yeah, I'm with you too.
The temptation wouldn't be there.
Right.
It's impossible.
Right, correct.
You just be like, you just don't have any money, so you can't get what you
Right.
trying to get.
So in the nonprofit space, we can start with a very simple budget, but it's a similar idea, right? It's here are the things we need. Here's what we think we can raise, And one of the things that's beautiful about it is by doing this, you've identified here's the 6 greatest needs we have. When you can make an ask that is for a specific thing, it's easier to raise funds. Then help us save children. I mean, that's nice,
Yeah.
but
You can say we want to run this particular program and it costs this much. That's
right,
easier.
correct, right. Okay, we've got some FAQs here for you. I'll answer these and then I'll open it for more for questions. Can you fundraise while you wait for your determination letter, right? You apply to the IRS for that recognition of tax status, and then typically, depending on which application you did, 6 weeks to 9 months later, they'll get back to you. And so can you fundraise it while you're waiting? Yes, you can. The only thing is that you cannot hold yourself out to be a recognized charity, and some institutions do require you to have that determination letter before they give, but many individuals do not. So you can just generally fundraise during that time. And if you get your determination letter, it is retroactive to the date of incorporation, so anyone who gave during that time, their tax deduction is intact. Where can you find funding? It's a great question. There are lots of options. There actually is, from a grant funding perspective, there are several different databases that are publicly available. Grant Station is one, for example, in terms of grants you might be able to apply for. There's a federal grant one. I think it's grants.gov even is the URL. But then also within your networks, your churches, your communities, within your networks. That's individuals account for a very significant percentage of fundraised dollars in the country. Increasingly, though, high net worth individuals are a greater and greater percentage of giving, and middle class and such are a much lower percentage of giving. So it is becoming more and more important to break into the high net worth circles. this year, aware. How do you keep your nonprofit status active? That's a great question. You may say, why do I have to ask that question? Because so many nonprofits don't do that. They don't do their annual filing with the IRS, called a 990. They don't do their annual filing, or it's now an every 5-year filing with the Indiana Department of Revenue, called an NP20. They often will miss those deadlines and miss those filings. There's also a Secretary of State business entity report due. It's basically, I'm still here, I still exist. That is due, I forget the frequency, every year or every other year. That's how you keep it active and alive. We call it the care and feeding of a nonprofit at my office, and it's like with my 7-week-old granddaughter. I mean, when she's screaming and she's hungry, it's like, okay, here's your bottle, right? That's how it is with a nonprofit. I mean, it's you got to take care of it. Can you pay board members? Oh, I skipped one. I'll get back to it. Can you pay board members? Yes, actually you can. There are a couple different ways. One is your board members can do services or provide services to the organization. Let's say you're on the board of, or you founded a Christian school, and one of your board members has a landscaping company, and they're like, look, I'll give you a 30% discount, but we'll do the landscaping for the year. The 30% discount, that's at cost for us, and all of that. So that you can pay that person as a landscaper. There's a process. The rest of the board needs to approve the contract and things, but you can pay them to provide services to the organization or on behalf of the organization. You also, approximately 3 to 5% of nonprofits pay their board members to be board members. These are typically very large and complicated nonprofits. You may not know this, but under Section 501 of the Internal Revenue Code, there are actually 29 subsections of tax-exempt organizations. 501c3, charity, that's the most common. C4, C5, C6, C2, C29. Some of that is credit unions, cemetery associations, mutual insurance companies. So large mutual insurance companies, they pay their directors usually. Credit union board members also often paid. So there are some types of nonprofits where it's far more common, but by and large, it's not very common to be paid to be a board member. But to be paid to do services, that's more common. When is it time to make my nonprofit a full-time job? That's a great question. So a really good benchmark, there are some factors here. A really good benchmark is, do you consistently have $100,000 of revenue annually or more? That's a pretty good benchmark. Another one is it's a question of like, what are the greater needs of the organization? The two most common first employees are either a part-time admin person or a full-time executive director, like the founder or executive director. Those are the two most common first positions. If it's the former, the like part-time admin, that gets a lot of the admin work off of that founder's or the board's shoulders, so they can focus on continuing to fundraise and build the organization. Then typically the second employee is the executive director, right? So it's that kind of thing. So we're talking about with your board, or your friends and colleagues or what have you, that question. And lastly, we did talk about this some. Can you charge for goods and services? The answer is yes. It's very common. But even if you're a primarily donative supported nonprofit, you can still do things like selling merch, or there are creative ways to leverage fee for service or program service revenue for your organization. So I've got a couple of examples that will probably get your wheels turning. We represent a client who is a halfway house / day release program for incarcerated individuals reentering into society. And the founder was like, well, wait a second, we are finding job placements for these folks in the community, and they're doing landscaping, or they're doing moving, services for people, and among other things. And he's like, well, I'll just start a moving company, and the nonprofit will, and we'll run it kind of like Two Men in a Truck, but not that brand. And then any net profits will come back and be used by the organization, and we'll sell it. But it's related to our tax-exempt status because it's for the purpose of helping these folks reentering from a period of incarceration, reentering society. That's a charitable program. It's helping them have firm and clear job training, so it is related to their tax-exempt status. So even if those moving services, which is typically not charitable, it can be done in a charitable way. Same exact nonprofit, but the landscaping side. So in that instance, you're selling landscaping services. Both of these examples are a nonprofit that you would think, there's probably no way to monetize their work. Well, actually, there is. You just got to be creative. It's fascinating. Questions? That's Holly, that's Spencer, and that's Robert. They're on my team. Yeah, any questions?
So, I'm a little, okay, when it comes to pay, I guess I'm a little confused,
Mhm.
so you say the owners can't take profits,
Yeah,
right?
because nonprofits technically don't have owners.
Okay, so the person that creates the nonprofit, what are they called?
Yeah, so the technical phrase is what's called a disqualified person. It's the business term. Yeah, the business term is like insider, right? So insiders or disqualified persons can't receive distributions of profit from the organization, but they can receive salaries. They can receive reasonable compensation. They can receive reimbursement for expenses, for example.
So let's say I make a nonprofit.
Mhm.
So the way I would get paid would be like through setting my own salary or
Well,
something?
yeah, so the nonprofit would set the salary. You would need to recuse yourself from the vote, but the board would say, what's a comparable salary for comparable size organization and comparable work in this geographic area? And you're like, how do they get that? That stuff is readily available. There are salary surveys, because of this rule, there are salary surveys readily available, all over the country of different types and sizes, typically for free. And they just look at that, and they then say, okay, yeah, this salary is reasonable. They vote to approve it. You recuse yourself, and then that's your salary.
Recusing yourself meaning that you can't vote on the board
On that matter.
on that. Okay.
Yeah. So actually, I will pull up.
So you could be a member of the board and vote, be the creator of the organization, and do work for the board and get paid for it.
Yes, that's what I did with Charitable Allies.
So I want to start a counseling ministry, but I would want to be a counselor. So I would be doing counseling.
That's right. I'm gonna pull up a. Okay, I was going to pull up. It's not. I can't find it. All right, let's come at this a different way. Well, that's good enough. This is 2021's. I have 2023's. I just can't find it as quickly as I want. It's put out it's Central Indiana. It's put out by an organization called Charitable Advisors, not to be confused with Charitable Allies. Brian and I have had some laughs about that. He's the owner of Charitable Advisors. And you'll see what it does is there are all these organizations that respond to a survey in January of what are you paying your people, what are their benefits, do they have retirement, do they have insurance, like whatever. And then they code and classify that data. I'm almost there, I'm pretty sure. There we go. So CEOs or executive directors, as of 2021 data, for an organization with 1 to 5 full-time staff, there were 106 of them that reported in this data set. The average salary was 77.5, minimum was 30, maximum was 190. Then you use your first quartile, median, and third quartile, right? Another way to slice it is annual budget. Less than 250K, there are 20 orgs. Average or median, average is mean, median is median, the other kind of average. Minimum, maximum, first and third quartile. So, and there are these kinds of data sets for many geographic areas all across the country, as well as there are like specialty organizations that don't neatly fit into a specific geographic locale, so you can look at a nationwide survey of those kinds of agencies.
What is first quartile and third quartile?
25th percentile, 75th percentile.
The top 25 and the bottom?
Yeah, third quartile is what's the 75th percentile? So the point at which 75% of people are beneath you in salary and 25% are above you. That's this quartile. First quartile is the 25% mark, where 25% are beneath you in salary, and then 75% are above you. I mean, you'll see, like, if an organization is greater than 10 million, 825,000 salary, right? The max.
Still be nonprofit.
Right.
The NFL.
Yeah. 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 In Indiana, the NCAA. Yeah, it
No,
is.
it's not.
Yeah, it is.
It is. It's the biggest load.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a charity, but it's
Yeah,
not.
that's not charity at all.
Yeah. No, it's not a charity. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Remember the 501c2,
Okay, so you're just
C3,
saying
C4.
it's a nonprofit.
It's not a
because it's-
C3.
yeah,
It's one of the
not a
others.
charity.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's safe to say like a large chunk of the budget goes towards salaries?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah. If it's a service providing organization, it's a really high percentage, 75, 80%. I mean, it can be really high. If it is a goods providing, then it's going to be a much smaller percentage because of how much is associated with the production and delivery of goods. But
Our church is about 60% of those. 60% goes to salary.
yeah, and you have 3 buildings to maintain, so yeah,
Yeah, we got less. 3.
I think, right?
Well, we have 2 separate buildings, but technically the one in Near West is.
Oh,
I guess that's technically one. We've got the house too. We've got a lot of stuff.
I forgot.
Yeah, and the park and the parking lot is. We have like 8 parcels.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Question.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the legality? I'll just ask it specifically. If our church started a nonprofit in order to get grants for the humanitarian stuff that we do that is ministry, so that we're not a church asking for money from grants,
Sure.
what's the legality of that? Like, how would we go about that?
Yeah, so I have to be careful in this kind of context. I can't give specific legal advice because it's also not privileged.
Yeah.
But what I can do is give legal educational information, and that's how I'll respond if that's okay. It is common for churches to create either CDCs, Community Development Corporations, or EDCs, Economic Development Corporations. And they either literally are those things, because that's a specific type of subsection within the code, or they just call it that, and it's kind of that, right? I mean, and almost always that's how churches then do that other type of work. So it's, to your point, right? It's often housing related, or community revitalization related, or humanitarian related, right? It's any number of these kinds of categories. Because so many institutions, foundations and things have policies that they won't give, they'll say they won't give to religious organizations, but often what they say and what they mean are different. Because a significant number of nonprofits are religious in nature, but they're not churches. So usually this phrase, we won't give to a religious organization, is we won't give to a church, and also we won't give for the purpose of proselytization or missions, right? Like the furthering of the gospel, specifically the conversion of saints. That's kind of what they're saying they won't give towards. But to make it,
It's a
you know,
religious
clean.
organization doing things in the community. That's not the same thing.
Right. Right.
That's kind of why we've been kicking that around, trying to figure out if we can kind of umbrella it.
Yes.
Do that differently.
Yeah. I mean, if I think about, there's a whole bunch of, is it Edgewood CDC, and Brook something, Brookside CDC. Eastern Star's got a bunch of entities, like, so. You know, it's just how ministry, or quasi ministry maybe, is done.
And that would be doable even if our church is under an umbrella corp like CD or 501c3 from the SBC.
Yeah. So that the answer is yes. Legally, it's permissible. We would need to look at the SBC, like the church's bylaws, as well as the SBC, whatever it's called, the contract, the canon, the covenant, whatever they call it. We need to look at that. But in terms of, like, as a matter of tax code and or nonprofit corporate law, is that kind of thing permissible? Absolutely. Okay. It's common. Yeah. Yeah, go right ahead.
Forgot it. But I have like 3 questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead, keep going.
Ask them all. Okay. Oh, could you talk more about the trial run? That you, I think that's what you mentioned at the beginning, like. The
Oh,
idea
fiscal
of-
sponsorship, yeah.
Yeah. Or I guess the idea of like, yeah.
Yep.
That.
So this is, I'm on the board of this organization, full disclosure. It's a charity. It's called Fiscal Sponsorship Allies. And what fiscal sponsorship does is it lets people who want to support or activate charitable projects, it helps them do that very quickly. Typically, it's 48 hours from when you apply to when you can already be fundraising. It's very quickly. And you raise the funds, we take care of the tax exemption, the donation receipts, all of that. You would get a debit card that you then use on an account that you set up through the software platform. It's powered by software called ReAlign, which is fiscal sponsorship management software. And so you would do that. What it basically means is you've got a charitable program that you want to do. You can do that thing and don't have to worry about the infrastructure of the nonprofit as much. And often what happens with fiscal sponsorship is like, wow, this is really working. Cool. Now you can go apply for your own tax exempt status and then start doing it on your own. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, we even have some sponsees that do that and then but the sponsorship is working so well, we're actually, even though we now have it, we're still going to keep going with the sponsorship. There are other reasons for that too. Major institutional funders like to see 3 or 5 years of financial performance for big grants. And so we have a number of sponsees that stay around and use our services for the big grants because maybe their entity is only 2 years old and they can't satisfy that need for multiple years.
So this isn't a fundraising
No.
service, it's a like a money management.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes care of all the legal compliance behind the scenes. Yeah.
So basically, the legals, it allows you to do your nonprofit work without having to worry about the legal part of it. You can just go do the work. I'm glad that exists because you talking about all the legal stuff and the boards and all that. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I just want to do the work.
That's right. I mean, that's exactly right. So that's fiscal sponsorship.
Sitting in board meetings sounds boring.
Unless you're into boiling frogs.
What?
Unless you're into boiling frogs.
What's that about?
I'm pretty sure it's a turn of phrase. I don't think he means it literally.
Right.
I was trying. Okay. And then I think you mentioned something about like when you're thinking about making a nonprofit, if there's already organizations that are doing what you want to do.
Mhm.
So, did you kind of say it'd be a better idea to join them in a way?
Yeah. So, I mean, what's fascinating is there's some interesting data. It's in the overall subject of nonprofit mergers, so nonprofits that do similar things coming together, and the funders think that there are way too many nonprofits doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's the number one thing that they want to see change in the industry is that there be fewer nonprofits that are all doing the same thing. Each nonprofit thinks it's doing it unique,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Of course they are.
That they are a unicorn, right? And the funder's like, no, you're not. Right? That's kind of the tension there. So it's possible you're a unicorn, but probably not, right? So then the question is, are there other nonprofits that are doing something similar, and can you come alongside them and do work with them? Yeah.
Instead of having 2 separate organizations, just grow one organization to be bigger.
Right. That's right.
Just like businesses do. instead of having multiple businesses doing the same thing, let's all just join together and be a bigger business.
Right.
Like a food court.
Kind of. That's different.
Oh yeah. What?
Is it common that organizations, I think you did say, is it common for organizations to agree to that? Like if they're doing something that you want to do, is it common for them to be okay with you joining them? Or is it going to be hard to convince someone to?
Yes and yes, right? Yes. Depends on the organization, depends on the risk tolerance of the people at the helm, it depends on the creativity of the people at the helm, it depends on the personalities involved. Right.
So if you can't get anybody that will let you
Right.
under them, you kind of have to start your own.
Right. Right. Yeah, then it's like, okay, I'll just do it better than you and I'll eat your lunch.
Fine, you don't want to let me help you, then I'll just do it on my own.
And I'll do it better than you.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not competitive at all.
I don't know why you and Autumn get along at all.
Right. Correct.
Okay, my last question.
I'm letting you choose.
The way you presented the information makes it seem kind of like digestible, but how hard is it on a scale of 1 to 10 to like make a nonprofit organization / how long does it take with like everything considered, I guess?
I mean, so that's a kind of long and complicated answer. I mean, the answer is it's hard, but anything worth doing is hard. And the skill set that it takes to start a nonprofit and then to grow it to 100K and then 250K and then $1 million and then $2.5 million and then 10 million, different skill set at every step because of the difficulty of scaling and staffing, training, relationship building and management, systems building and management. It's very difficult to keep going and keep going and keep going. Many organizations plateau. They plateau at different, those steps and others. There's a fascinating article from a publication called the Harvard Business Review in the mid-1980s. I know, but it's actually relevant. And it talked about how there are the 5 stages of growth of businesses. And one of the things it talked about was the interest of the business and the interest of the founder / CEO. And at each sort of stage, there's this opportunity for the founder to say, I'm making enough money, this is successful, I'm good here. And then potentially that founder just sort of lets their foot off the gas, the business does its thing while the founder goes off and plays, so to speak, right? Like whatever it is. And when that happens, the business will typically stagnate. And then it'll come a point where that business needs to decide, am I going to, that founder in the business needs to decide, are we going to reinvest and make this thing better, or is it going to shrink? And it happens over and over.
Because you can't just maintain that same
Correct.
level indefinitely.
In the business world, right, and this is directly analogous, I'm talking about business, right, but this is there's been some fascinating research in the last 10 years applying all these business principles to the nonprofit world, and we find that because human psychology is what it is, they're directly applicable. The incentives are different. In the business world, it's make money for the owners. In the nonprofit world, it's make money so we can do more good, right? I mean, like, okay, but like it still comes down to making money. No margin, no mission. If you don't have any margin, any profit, you won't survive very long. If you're always running the red, in the negative all the time, you'll close. Right. So no margin, no mission. So there's all this research that's now being applied to the nonprofit space, and I love it. I'm a bit of a wonk in that respect. And so there's all these phases then of growth where it's like, are we gonna do what it takes to retool things and be prepared for the next stage of growth and then keep that growth going? Because It's like being in a stream or in a river. If you stop paddling, you will go backwards eventually. You know, your momentum will keep carrying you, and then you'll stop, and then you'll start going backwards. And that's just how it is. So, so the answer is very hard. And the skill set of someone who maintains enough relationships to maintain $250,000 a year of fundraising is a different skill set from someone who can do that plus operate a $500,000 business, is a different skill set than someone who can replicate the operation of that $500,000 business into a $5 million business, right? It's just totally different. It's just a
It's also
totally
probably
different
why you
skill
keep
set.
bringing on more people during that time because
Mhm.
you're going to need different skill sets. And you
Correct,
can't.
correct,
If you don't already have them, you have to go find people that do have them.
correct. And there's fascinating research around if a CEO doesn't remake themselves every 5 years, they will ossify and their organization will experience negative consequences because of it.
That's awesome.
Like fossilize,
Okay.
but not quite to that degree.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. But
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Hope it wasn't too boring.
Very informative.
Yeah.
oh, turn into bone.
Or bony tissue. To become rigid or fixed in
Yeah, that's,
attitude
I was
to,
gonna say that's
to
probably the
cease
more relevant.
developing,
Yeah,
right?
Ordinary.
that's the definition you were going for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a difference between getting a degree in nonprofit management and getting a degree in nonprofit law? Like, is there such thing as getting a degree in just the law part?
No, there's
Okay.
not.
So then they're all kind of the
Well, nonprofit
mixed.
management, I mean, nonprofit law means you would be a lawyer,
Right.
right? Nonprofit management is more of a management degree. So SPIA has nonprofit management. The School of Philanthropy has philanthropic management, which is kind of nonprofit management, and then law is law. And there are business and nonprofit tracks within law, but
Okay. So you're basically getting a law degree
yes,
if you were going that way.
correct, yes.